Dick, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be with you this morning. I first learned about Interfaith Power and Light maybe 15 years ago and have been intrigued by what you do and what you're all about. So it's a real honor to be standing in front of you this morning. I'm going to start this morning with things that are a bit of a downer. It's hard not to give you a bit of a downer these days. But I will end with some words of hope and inspiration and then turn to Jim, who will be talking more about vision. We are learning more every day of the extent to which humans have damaged our earth and its inhabitants. The report came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on August 8th. It's a very long title, but they just call it Climate Change and Land. And what this told us was that agriculture, forestry, and other land use activities represent 23% of the total net anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. So 23% is going into that, and a lot of that is through industrial agriculture. I'll be talking more about that and about alternatives to it. The hopeful side of this report is that sustainable land management, these are both quotes, sustainable land management, including sustainable forest management, can prevent and reduce land degradation, maintain land productivity, and sometimes reverse the adverse impacts of climate change on land degradation. It can also contribute to mitigation and adaptation. And as folks who care about climate change, these terms are probably very familiar to you. But the fact that land use can actually be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is really powerful. We need to be moving toward those land uses as quickly as possible. So this was August 8th. This came out to a lot of fanfare. This next report was not quite as widely publicized, but it came out on September 24th. This is a special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And what this told us was that since the mid-20th century, the shrinking cryosphere, that's the part of the Earth that's covered with ice, so the Arctic and high mountain areas, has led to predominantly negative impacts on food security, water resources, water quality, livelihoods, health, and well-being. And in addition, future shifts in fish distribution and decreases in their abundance and fisheries catch potential due to climate change will hurt income, livelihoods, and food security of communities that are dependent on marine resources. So two pieces of really serious bad news, I would say wake-up calls, from a panel that is notoriously conservative. The IPCC has told us, has been tracking the impacts of climate change for years. I think they're up to their 6th assessment. I think that's the next one. I'm not positive, but at each assessment, what they have told us within the period of time after that report has come out, we've gone even farther. Climate change has happened. The impacts have been felt even more than the IPCC had predicted. So it's the nature of the IPCC. They're quite conservative. They go by consensus decisions. It's the nature of the panel that they are not going to say anything unless they are sure with very high confidence that this is factual, that they can stand behind it as scientists. So in the face of news like this, what can our response be? Especially as people of faith who feel a spiritual connection to the earth and are saddened, we're grieving to see the impacts that people have made, but we're also feeling compelled to act in some way. And I'm sure that applies to all of you. You wouldn't be here on a lovely Saturday morning without that compulsion to act. So do we just hunker down and try to keep the status quo as long as we possibly can? Most people in the United States, and certainly our federal administration, are doing this. They're digging in deeper and deeper to oblivion and hanging on desperately to a way of life to which they've become accustomed. At the same time as the possibility of that way of life recedes for more and more people with rising inequality. Or do we aim for what Jim Bendel calls deep adaptation to the coming crisis, looking it squarely in the face? Or do we actively fight the degradation of all that we hold most dear about the earth? A report came out, and you folks may have seen this, it was in the New Yorker. It was by Jonathan Franzen, who most people know as a fiction writer, but it was called What If We Stop Pretending? And he said, folks, the climate apocalypse is coming. We can't stop it. It's coming with dramatic environmental and social consequences. To prepare for it in a rational way, we need to stop pretending that it's possible to avert this crisis. We need to admit that we can't prevent it. This article generated an incredible response of anger from people. There was a scientist at Columbia University who, the day after it came out, she posted an article that said, "Shut up, Jonathan Franzen." That was the title of the article. But honestly, if you go and read his article yourself, I think you'll find that he's not an extremist. He's basically just saying that there are things we can do to prepare for this coming climate crisis, and unless we face it head on, we can't mobilize ourselves to do that preparation that's absolutely essential. So, most of my talk will be about food and food systems and agriculture, because that's what I do. So turning to the food system in North America, we can see plenty of dysfunction. Remember, this is the system that in part is contributing to 23% of greenhouse gas emissions, almost a quarter. Supermarkets, where most people buy their food, are offering more than 33,000 items on average, yet diet-related diseases caused by eating that very food that people are buying from supermarkets. Those diet-related diseases are at the top among the killers in the United States. We see increasing corporate control of all food system activities. More than 11% of people in this country are food insecure. They're not sure about where their next meal will come from. And the United States is the only industrialized country that fails to recognize food and nutrition as human rights that everyone has. Workers in the food system, from farm workers to people working in restaurants or as cashiers, have high rates of food insecurity. So the very people who are bringing us our food are hungry themselves. And alternative sources of food, the co-ops, the CSAs, the farm stands, direct marketing, all those things that we love so much in Vermont, those things remain marginal. About 96% of purchases of food in this country come from supermarkets and big box stores like Walmart. So, what should our food system provide? If we back up and think, okay, this is what we're getting now from the food system: food insecurity, environmental degradation, corporate control, what should it be providing? And these are the sorts of things that I think all of you would agree should be coming from our food system. Healthy food for everyone as a human right, environmental quality, public health, community revitalization around food, which we're beginning to see in some places in Vermont as foresighted policymakers are looking at food as an economic generator. Fair wages for farm workers, decent livelihoods for farmers. That's the problem with the dairy industry now, that farmers are not even making the costs of operation from the prices at which they have to sell their milk. And food democracy, or real control over our food system. In other words, you could say this all looks kind of hopeless because the neoliberal economic system in which we live that has brought us all these negative impacts, how are we going to fight that? But I would say that food belongs in a different political and economic system than this neoliberal economic system, and more people are coming to agree with that. So there are two production alternatives for food that are becoming clearer, and these two production alternatives are in a massive global battle. Industrialized agriculture, the form of food production that we've embraced in the United States, depends on mechanization, on large-scale farms. The products and the farms are standardized and uniform. They're monocultures. We use a lot of inputs in this country. Irrigation, antibiotics, which are leading to antibiotic resistance in the amounts and the ways that we're using them in livestock production. Lots of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, which are actively killing soils, and we know more and more now that the pesticides are killing pollinators as well as songbirds and a lot of other creatures, aquatic organisms that we care about. The alternative to this industrialized agriculture that we've embraced here is diversified agroecological systems. This is polycultures, growing a lot of different crops in one place instead of a monoculture. They're highly biodiverse. They tend to be small scale. They don't have to be, but they tend to be small scale. They recycle materials and restore soil fertility. They're more reliant on human labor and draft animals than on fossil fuels for energy. And at some point in the near future, we need to face up to the fact that we can't keep producing our food with fossil fuels. We are completely reliant on fossil fuels. Even organic farmers are reliant on fossil fuels. And this form of food production is focused more on producing food for people than producing industrial products like bioplastics and agrofuels, things like ethanol. In one of the workshops, I had the pleasure of doing a workshop with John Turner, who's sitting in the back of the room. We'll be talking more about agroecology. This is a form of agriculture that's growing in popularity and significance worldwide, even though the United States is doing its absolute best to squelch agroecology. But we'll be talking about the way that John is applying agroecological principles on his own farm, Wild Roots in Bristol. So it's not just something that is applying to the global South. In the United States, with our reliance on industrial agriculture, we have gone far too far in the direction of emphasizing the economic benefits of agriculture. In this diagram, I'm trying to show the economic, social, and environmental benefits of food production systems are all interlinked. And if we emphasize any one of these areas too much, then the others shrivel, they die away. And that's exactly what's happened in this country, as we have overemphasized income that farmers can get from farms, trade and marketing, then we have seen the health impacts of the food system decrease. We've seen the cultural advantages of food systems wither away. We've seen severe environmental impacts of our food system. So it's possible to be looking at all of these dimensions of the food system at the same time, but we sure have not done that over the last few decades, actually since about the 1950s in this country. I asked Dick to say that I haven't yet taken a no planes pledge, and I know some people who have. Maybe someday I'll be there. I hope I will. I'm trying to travel less. But I just got back from a big conference in Rome, and one of the important things about that conference was the release of a report that people from civil society, social movements, and non-governmental organizations had been fighting for years. It's a report on agroecology. And agroecology, a term that might not be familiar to you folks at all. A lot of people in this country have never heard of it. I'm sure you've heard of organic farming, which is one type of agroecology, but there are a lot of other ways that farmers can practice agroecology. Regenerative agriculture is coming into popularity in this country, grazing systems, but also agroforestry, permaculture. Those are a couple of other forms of agroecology. Agroecology is understood as a science, a set of practices, and a movement. It's a science in which the best science that we have about food production is being integrated with indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. So the methods that farmers are using are evidence-based, but they incorporate the best of indigenous and traditional practices. A set of practices, that's kind of obvious. A movement maybe is not quite so obvious, but agroecology has been adopted by a large group of people around the world who represent peasant farmers and fishers and pastoralists as the very best form of agriculture that we can use to reverse climate change, to provide decent incomes to farmers, to provide healthy food for people. So people all around the world are saying, this is where we need to go. This chart shows how at the bottom, and I'm sure you can't read it at the back, but it's showing how from the 1930s, when people first started talking about agroecology, initially it was just seen as a scientific discipline, as this integration of ecology with agriculture. But then people started to say, well, it's also a set of practices, and started more intentionally combining indigenous practices, some of which are really marvelous, the way that indigenous peoples have been able to farm on the same land for millennia. In some cases, we sure haven't been able to do that in this country. Everywhere we've gone with the industrialized food system, we have degraded that land and made it less fertile. But some indigenous practices have actually made land more fertile. And then finally, agroecology as a social movement started emerging in the 1980s with the call for the right to food being merged in with agroecology, and the understanding that agroecology was a really good way to approach rural and territorial development, and food sovereignty, again a term that might not be familiar to you in this room, but a term that means a lot to people around the globe. People who want more control over their food system, who aren't happy with the corporate control that is encroaching more and more on our food system. There are many so-called lock-ins that prevent the transformation from industrial agriculture to agroecology. This diagram came from a report that was done by a group called EPIS Food. I work with that group. It's the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, a somewhat pretentious title, but we wanted something that people would listen to. And we thought if we called ourselves experts, that maybe other people would think we were experts too. So we meet a couple of times a year. We produce a lot of reports. This report, From Uniformity to Diversity, was picked up and has been very influential. It's talking about that move from industrial agriculture to diversified agroecological systems. And we try to take a political economy approach in all of our reports to understand how power plays into the topics that we consider. So we were looking at all the things that keep people from making this shift. Things like short-term thinking and compartmentalized thinking. We put health in one box, we put agriculture in another box, we put environment in another box, and we fail to see the ways that they're all interrelated. Export orientation in this country. We think we need to produce more and more and more and more, and we just export the surplus, often to the disadvantage of small-scale farmers in other countries who are having our subsidized corn or other crops dumped on them at prices below what they need to charge in order to make a decent income. Our expectations of cheap food, that food will ever be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, Our idea that we somehow feed the world, which is crazy because it's small-scale farmers who are actually feeding the world. The Food and Agriculture Organization, which is not any radical outfit, but the Food and Agriculture Organization says 75 to 80% of the food that's being consumed in the world is produced by small-scale farmers. And most of them are using agroecological practices or as close to that as they can achieve. We also have this problem of path dependency. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense to you folks. If you're an economist, I'm sure it does, but it's the idea that once you've invested in a certain way of thinking, or you've invested all your capital in, let's say, a dairy barn, what are you going to do? You can't easily convert that dairy barn and your fields of hay or pasture, you can't convert them into a nice small-scale vegetable operation. You've got so much sunk capital in that particular option that it's really hard to shift out of it. We have path dependency in research too, with researchers who've invested their whole lives in figuring out what's the best application of synthetic fertilizer or pesticides to apply to this field. And it's really hard for them to back up and say, whoa, I have been on the wrong track all my life. That's humiliating to tell a researcher that he or she needs to rethink the whole approach that they've taken. So all of these things are interfering with this transition to agroecology. In the middle of all these lock-ins is the concentration of power. Another report that we did through EPAS Food, and these are all easy to get. I put the URL there if you want to take a look. This is about market concentration, and it's horrifying. The extent to which we have moved beyond competitive markets in almost all agricultural inputs, seeds, pesticide, fertilizer, equipment, and also the extent to which the companies themselves, the companies that process food, that distribute food, that retail food, have become more and more concentrated. And what this means is that power is in the hands of fewer and fewer people, not in our hands. They're in the hands of just a few people who are controlling these companies, and those people are beholden to shareholders, in most cases, who want a profit. They want a good return on their investment. They don't care that much about health or about environmental quality unless it's really cutting into their bottom line. So this is not a good direction to go. So I've talked a lot about the bad things, but I promise you I'm not going to leave you with this. I want to turn to the sources of inspiration and hope for restorative change. And after I tell you what I have found to be sources of hope and inspiration, I'll turn things over to Jim and he can talk more about vision, which is absolutely essential for moving in the direction we want. If we don't have a vision of where we want to go, we won't have any idea if we've actually arrived at that place. So some of the hopes, the sources of inspiration and hope, I'll give you three. Some of them are just ideas. One idea, and again, I know you can't see this, but I just wanted to show you that a lot of people are thinking about this idea of different forms of economic systems, social economies, solidarity economies, sharing economies, ways that people can get food in that doesn't require buying food, which is really important if you're quite poor. That's the main reason people are food insecure in this country. They're too poor to obtain the food they need. But if you have people around you who are willing to share food or willing to barter for food, then you might be able to get healthy food anyway, even if you're quite poor. So these ideas are intriguing. They're really interesting. I think the social and solidarity economy, especially in Europe, that seems to be a place where these ideas are advancing rapidly. Another idea, and Rua could talk to you quite a bit about this, is the idea of transition towns. preparing for this climate collapse that we see in the near future. Charlotte is a transition town. There are other transition towns around Vermont. Maybe you'll want to create a transition town where you live. Another idea that I have found to be compelling is the idea of commons, that many of the things that once upon a time were in the commons and available to anyone without paying for it have become privatized and commoditized. And I just learned yesterday, maybe other people in the audience know this already, but I just learned that David Bollier, who recently wrote a book called Free, Fair, and Alive about the commons and the post-capitalist future, he's going to be in Middlebury in just a little over a week, November 6th, in Franklin Environmental Center. And I would advise you to get there early because the Orchard Room, which for some reason they have decided is the place to hold this talk, I kind of hope that they'll move it to a bigger space. But it's not a huge room, so I'm guessing it'll be standing room only. Was that a hand up?
Me. Oh, he's also speaking November 7th in Bristol.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So those of you who don't want to cram into the Orchard Room can go up to Bristol. Where will he be in Bristol?
It's the Walkover Gallery.
That's really small.
Even
And
smaller.
it's limited, and it's also limited by tickets, so get your tickets early.
Okay, well, this one's free, but as I said, it's not a huge room. So get there early. I think this is going to be a really popular talk. It reminds me a little bit of the talk by Robin Wall Kimmerer that was in this room. That's the last time I was in this room. A marvelous talk, but the room was packed. And I don't think people realized how hungry we are to hear alternatives. She's a lovely indigenous woman who also has a faculty position as a botanist in New York State. But she was talking about indigenous cosmologies, indigenous views of our connection with nature, and what a great talk. She was fantastic. So I think David Bollier will also be quite interesting.
Can you spell his last name?
B-O-L-L-I-E-R, Bollier. He's written several books with his partner Silke Helfrich, who I assume is German with a name like that. But as far as I know, it's just David who's coming to talk with us. So ideas can be inspiring, but action can also be inspiring. Having good leaders, whether those leaders are farmers who are showing us the right way to farm, people like John Turner, and I'm going to really embarrass John by turning to him here. But I consider John's farming methods to be incredibly inspiring. And what he's been able to do with his farm is really remarkable. Another example is what the Prime Minister in Ethiopia did last June. He started a program called Green Legacy, and in that program they planted more than 350 million trees in 12 hours. If you can imagine, here's Ethiopia, which has been responsible for a minuscule proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, planting trees to combat climate change, to mitigate climate change, as well as to try to push back on desertification, which is a huge problem for Ethiopia. But the desertification is caused by climate change to a large extent. So good leaders can make a big difference too. Personally, I find more and more that the deepest and most powerful inspiration comes from people within social movements at the front lines facing crises that threaten their lives and their livelihoods. Here's a picture of Anurati Roy, who wrote a book called Walking with the Comrades. And I love this passage that she wrote in this book. She says, can we expect that an alternative to what looks like certain death for the planet will come from the imagination that has brought about this crisis in the first place? It seems unlikely. If there's any hope for the world at all, it does not live in climate change conference rooms or in cities with tall buildings. It lives low down on the ground with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains, and the rivers will protect them. To gain this philosophical space, it is necessary to concede some physical space for the survival of those who may look like the keepers of our past, but who may really be the guides to our future. So here she is in India walking with the comrades, but there's social movements that are active and people coming together in North America as well. There are many places where people have come together to fight for a common vision. I'll give you just a few examples so you can see what I'm talking about. Here's a project from Canada, a booklet of food policy, a people's food policy for Canada called Resetting the Table. This came out in 2009, and it started as just a kitchen table conversations. People from an organization called Food Secure Canada went all over the country, sitting down in people's kitchens and talking to people and saying, what kind of food system do you want? How do you want your food system to be providing food to you? What kind of food do you want? What kind of say do you want in that food system? So the good news from this project back in 2009 is that June of this year, Canada actually instituted a new food policy. First time Canada has ever had a food policy. And the vision behind that food policy is that all people in Canada are able to access a sufficient amount of safe, nutritious, and culturally diverse food. There are many, many First Nations people in Canada. They didn't have quite as thorough a job of genocide as we did in the United States. Canada's food system is resilient and innovative, sustains our environment, and supports our economy. So that's the vision. It's come out from Agri-Food Canada. I'm working with a group of people to try to set up a U.S. food policy. Again, some colleagues from EPIS Food, and we'll be holding a meeting in Washington, D.C. next March, and then regional roundtables. We decided we didn't quite have the people power to muster kitchen table conversations all over the country, but we're going to be meeting everywhere to try to figure out what a food policy looks like and how it differs from region to region. But here's Canada serving a great example. Canada does not have a farm bill like we do, and the farm bill is nothing near a food bill, even though most of the money that's allocated to the farm bill goes into SNAP and other federal food assistance programs. Here's another project that I worked on. It was a New England food vision. And we came out with a vision that would support healthy food for all, sustainable farming and fishing, and thriving communities. You'll see over and over that what people want is remarkably similar. They want healthy food for everyone. They want sustainable farming and fishing. They want farmers to be supported. They want thriving rural communities. One of the things that's in danger in Vermont right now is young people move away because farm jobs pay so little. This New England food vision has been picked up. I think I have one more slide about it. The University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute is our backbone organization. It has been sponsoring the New England food vision and has taken it out to legislatures all around New England and has met tremendous enthusiasm from legislators who really want to do the things that this vision entails. The vision would result in 50% of the value of our food that we consume in New England coming from New England. So a lot of it is about relocalization and investing more in creating farms, marketing the food that comes from local farms, which Vermonters have been leaders in for a long time. Here's another project, a European Union Food and Farming Forum that created an EU food policy, a common food policy, to replace the common agricultural policy that the EU has now. But again, a lot of the same ideas, much of the same vision behind this. And then finally, what I consider to be the most inspiring of the visions for the future is food sovereignty, this idea of regaining control over our food system. This is a picture from the Committee on World Food Security that meets every year in Rome, the meeting that I just came back from. And the young woman on the screen represents a peasant organization. And she is talking to a room full of delegates from all over the world about what conditions are actually like in her community. One of the very interesting things about this particular structure in the Committee on World Food Security is that people from social movements can talk directly to people, the Minister of Agriculture, or other people from high-ranking offices in their countries, and say, no, these reports you're reading that everything is fine on the ground, this is not what we're experiencing. We're experiencing militarization. We're experiencing being shot for trying to defend our land or defend our water. So the fact that these people are coming from social movements and speaking in this forum is really significant. Food sovereignty is growing worldwide. These two images down at the bottom are from the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is regrouped, and they're having a meeting in New Hampshire, and I don't remember the date, but it's coming up very soon. It might even be November 2nd. It's a day that I know I couldn't make. But if you look up online, U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, you'll find when they're meeting, and if you want to be engaged in that, they would welcome your participation. So these are all examples of people coming together and acting on the basis of their vision, not just being passive, not just waiting for the collapse to come, but actually trying with all their power to fight. These are the principles of food sovereignty, that it focuses on food for people, it values food providers by providing a decent livelihood, decent wages for them. It localizes food systems and puts control locally. It builds knowledge and skills through sharing, and it works with nature. These are all things that are very consistent with agroecology, which is why agroecology is the preferred food production system for people who are fighting for food sovereignty. Now, to conclude, I'll leave you with these words from Nelson Mandela, and I assume that people in the back can read it. Anybody not able to read it in the back there? Okay. He says, action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming. But vision with action can change the world. And that's precisely what we hope this meeting will help to inspire. We're living in a decade that will determine the future of humanity. A decade, 10 years. And we must choose to act. Part of the action that's needed is solidarity with those I showed you whose lives are much worse than ours, who are putting their lives on the line to fight for their land and water against land grabs and water grabs by powerful entities. They are fighting against the economic system that allows us in this room to live in comparative ease at their expense. But an important part of the action needed is to do all we possibly can to restore and protect the earth from further degradation. This is not optional. Our survival depends on it. Thank you for listening.